Hello, this is Jacob. Welcome to Polysophical. Today I want to turn away from my discussion of Peter Thiel and the impending AI apocalypse. We're going to return to a series of comments that I got actually on my Mormons Are Too Obedient video. I had some really fun exchanges with people, very respectful disagreements, and I was able to talk very briefly about why I think the sort of hyperfixation on a purity culture, on more fronts than just sexual purity, but a broader purity culture and obedience-focused mindset, why these things can be both good and bad. And I'm focusing on some of the cons, if there are pros and cons, to promoting a culture that is heavily focused on strict obedience to a certain set of laws. A lot of the cons, the bad things that come along with that sort of a mindset, are what could be called second-order consequences, or perhaps even higher-order consequences. And I want to talk a bit about what those are, how they differ from unintended consequences, and then give a series of examples from economics and politics, how they relate to the church, contemporarily speaking, and from the scriptures, so that you can all get a better understanding of what a second-order consequence or second-order effect is. So first, in terms of unintended versus second-order effects, an unintended consequence is the broad term. Any outcome of an action that was not deliberately planned or foreseen, that is an unintended consequence. So these can be positive, negative, or neutral. They can often occur at a first-order level. So the proximal effect, the immediate effect, immediate surprises of a particular action. All of these are unintended consequences. And they can happen later as well, like in the second order. So if you take a logical chain and you have the action, let's say that's circle number one. And then out of that circle, you have these branches that go to first order effects. The things that are immediate effects of that particular choice or action, like if you have, this is going to be a little bit of a mean example, but if you have a child who is screaming and you put them in their room, the immediate effect is, well, first they are in their room, but they are unable to cause damage to things. The parent now has a bit of space to reassess and address things. If, let's say, the toddler was coloring on the wall or whatever happened, like that's just an off-the-cuff example of first-order effects. They're just the things that immediately follow a given action. And some of these can be unintended, so that's why unintended consequences is the broader of the two terms than when compared to second-order consequences or effects. So second-order effects are more specific to the timing and the causality chain. So returning to that image, if you have these circles, so the original circle is the action, and then you have these branching lines to their own circles. That's a series of first-order effects, and then off of those first-order effects, you have the branching effect going off again, and those are second-order effects. And then you have third and fourth and higher order effects. This is just a logical chain of events, a way of describing how one action can directly impact multiple series, multiple orders of consequences with unintended but also with intended effects. And that is, well, another big difference between second-order effects and unintended consequences, is that they are usually, but not always, unintended. You can have intended second-order effects. It's just you have to really think through things, and there is a level of risk involved. It may not go how you planned because of the staggered nature of how second-order consequences unfold compared to a first-order effect. It's more difficult to reason through. And I think that this ultimately touches into right hemisphere modes of thinking. For those of you who understand Ian McGilchrist's work, that the right hemisphere is much more adept at understanding and planning for second, third, fourth, higher order consequences when compared to the left hemisphere, which focuses on proximal effects only. So to clarify again, not every unintended consequence is a second-order effect. However, some second-order effects can be anticipated if one thinks carefully. So my claim is that second-order consequences can and should be planned for, which is difficult and at some level improbable to do correctly. But it is still an exercise which should be undertaken by any leader or policymaker or boss or parent or church leader or whoever. If for no other reason than attempting to understand second-order effects encourages long-range thinking and hopefully breaks the cycle of reactivity in decision-making. Now, what do I mean by the cycle of reactivity? It's simply this. Everybody has their own personality, their own baggage, their own strengths, their own weaknesses. You as a person are unique, and that gives you certain propensities to react in certain ways when presented with a certain situation. Here's an example, the topic of abortion. The politics of abortion largely fall on personality lines, based on personality metrics and the studies of moral psychology. How people vote really strongly follows personality metric lines on the Big Five personality scale, with those who are higher in openness leaning more left, those higher in conscientiousness leaning more right, and there's obviously a lot more nuance than that, but the reactivity, the reaction to that topic of abortion, boom, trigger word. This is a very heated topic and debate surrounding that topic. That reaction that you have is largely coming from a mixture of your genetics, your biology, and the way in which you were raised and how those have shaped your internal sense of self and personality. So I think that thinking through second-order consequences actually helps to break the cycle of reactivity and utilize a more rational and intuitive way of thinking that isn't so punchy, that isn't so, reactive. I can't remember if I've said this on a previous video, but it's something that I want to go into more in the future, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time here. But I think that this is what moral agency truly is breaking the cycle of reactivity and allowing ourselves to get above our own innate gut reactions and think through, not even just necessarily in a logical sense, but to conceptualize the scenario and plan for second order effects and want those to go well, not just I have my gut reactions and I'm going to always follow them no matter what, because that's the natural way of things. That's the natural man, you could say. And so to get above that, to actually engage in agency and not just the illusion of choice when you're just following your gut instincts, that requires leveling up, so to speak, and getting out of proximal effects or just gut reactions and strategizing for second order effects. What do you want to have happen long range from this given situation? And even longer range, higher order effects. What is your ultimate goal? What is your highest order thing and value of worship in this world? And you can make the choice as to what that will be and express faith, which is acting as if it were toward that given value. And that is why theology is so important, is because it guides the value structures and the higher order effects that people strive for in their lives, in their communities, etc. So I'll get into that in another video because it requires more than what I can give it today. So again, following my notes and recapping a bit of the right hemisphere, left hemisphere engagement going on, first order effects engage the linear left hemisphere, the linear thinking left hemisphere because it's easy to see from 1 to 2, and that is the initial action to the first order effect. Those things can be thought through with a relatively low amount of probabilistic thinking. But when you get into second order effects, you can fall into left hemisphere traps of thinking linearly, but it's a lot less likely to work. You need the holistic thinking of the right hemisphere in order to truly understand what potentialities exist at the second order level and the third and beyond. This is in a large part because second order effects rely heavily on how a policy is enacted or how a particular crackdown is apparent or boundary setting between individuals or whatever action is. It's how it is done, the specific qualia of that action, of that policy, the soft incentives that it creates. An idea can be good and sound, but if it is implemented in a different way, you will get different second order effects. And something else to keep in mind is this thing called Goodhart's law, which is when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to become a good measure. What's an example of this? Here's an example that for all the church-going Latter-day Saints may be prescient if you've gone on a mission, which is the key indicators, specifically baptisms and lessons taught, lessons with member present, contacts, all these things that we're asked to keep track of. When those become the target, they cease to become a good measure in the sense that if a missionary is truly striving to do, I guess, the good things in their heart, to preach the gospel, to do the Lord's will, to be where the Lord wants them to be at any given moment, those things may not immediately translate into key performance indicators in the same way that a more, well, not necessarily sociopathic, but type A, numbers-driven missionary who doesn't understand the spiritual aspects of what he is doing, but does understand the metrics, is going to go out there and hunt for the metrics. And along the way, I've seen this before, piss people off, and fellow missionaries and would-be investigators, people in the ward, all the above. They're going to anger them because they're too gung-ho, they're too intense. They are not empathizing with the actual people in their given situations. They're just pushing so hard for the numbers. And that is a way in which the metric has stopped becoming an effective measure. It has simply become the target of action. And that whole effect, that Goodhart's law effect, is a great example of the second-order consequences of an obedience-minded culture. When that becomes the only thing that matters is obedience to specific laws, you get a transfer of the laws going from being like very useful guidelines to being the metrics of the society itself, the institution itself, and that has second-order effects, some of which we will get to in a little bit. So going down the list here and talking about some different examples of second-order effects, remember that a given second-order effect is just one of many. It's not the second-order effect. It is one of the more salient second-order effects, plural. Since there are many first-order effects, and therefore by default there must be even more second-order effects, even more third-order effects, and higher-order effects, etc. But that doesn't mean that all of them are equally salient or important, relevant. So Reason TV, which is a libertarian YouTube channel, they have this really funny series called Great Moments and Unintended Consequences. And they have a ton of examples of second-order consequences, unintended consequences, all of them really, the unintended variety of second-order consequences and effects. But, again, worth reminding everybody, second-order effects do not have to be unintended. So we'll get to a few of those and how they worked. I think one really interesting example of a sort of financial or economic incentive structure that kept second-order consequences in mind was the GI Bill. that the proximal effect of the GI Bill is that those who served in the armed forces for a particular period of time, in particular, they were able to come back home and get the education that they needed without incurring a lot of debt, and then go out into the workforce. And then, of course, the second order effect is really the blossoming of an American middle class. I don't think that it's by accident that what we could call the golden age of the American middle class happens to line up with the greatest generation and the baby boomers, who both had access to the GI Bill and all sorts of other benefits that the government was willing to give out to those who served in the armed forces at that time. Now, an example in finance of the opposite, of not forward thinking, of simply preying upon the fruits of the moment, would be the credit default swap shenanigans and market crash of 2008. That it became not just more lucrative to cash in on these subprime mortgages and deal in credit default swaps between large asset managers, risk management, but they saw this as just the first order effect. This is just what we do right now. This is how we can make money right now. Proximal effects, not even thinking long range. And those who did think long range were lambasted as loonies and insane people. I mean, Michael Burry and the likes. If you've seen, oh shoot, what's that Christian Bale movie? I actually haven't seen this movie, but I have researched Michael Burry. Oh, The Big Short. If you've seen The Big Short, then you know what I'm talking about. And the short range thinking that dominated Wall Street, and then it all blew up. The second order effect of all of this poor risk management, first order effect being they make a lot of money. The second order effect is that the bubble pops and people start defaulting on their loans because they were given loans when they should not have been, and the whole system comes crashing down. And then there's all these third and fourth level effects that ripple through the entire economy. And it's more than just the real estate market. It's also the big insurance companies who were backing these loans. And the whole thing was just an absolute mess. And we're kind of still reeling from the higher order effects of those really shady decisions made by the banking class in 2005, 6, 7, leading up to the market crash in 2008. So I think all of that ultimately gives a good flavor as to what a second order effect is, how it is different from an unintended consequence. And next time, I'd like to give a lot more examples, not only in the subject of finance and economics, but also in government policy, in parenting, in church governance, and how those governing policies ripple down through the parents and the youth and into the individual lives of people and have second order effects of varying degrees and kind. So I hope you stick around for the next video that should be coming soon. And until next time, thank you for joining us. This is Jacob with the Polysophical Society.